Okay, recording to the cloud. So at the beginning of every unit, I try to jump online and on camera, I guess, and show you that I'm still here and I still am, cooking along. So I got my hair kind of pulled up today, but just wanted to say hello and welcome to Unit 3. Before we start talking specifically about the configuration for Unit 3, just want to go over a couple of things. So first of all, my apologies that the previous class on Halloween has not yet been posted. Unfortunately, I had a really serious emergency with my daughter, and we were in the emergency room about 6 a.m. on Friday, which, not to get into too many details, ended up being 2 days in ICU, so it's pretty serious. And she's okay right now, but she's going to be in the hospital for a while. So I'm a little behind. So if anybody sent me emails, I'm going to be working over the next couple of days to try to get caught up. I actually had to cancel my Friday class, my Friday afternoon class. So that's where that is at. And oh, thank you. Yeah, it's, it's tough, but it's just kind of the way it is. Kiddos, got to do what you got to do. So just to recap a little bit on scheduling, if you weren't in attendance in class on Thursday, we did do some polling about our next session for flashcards for Unit 2, which will be held, I had to grab my sheet here just to make sure I had it in front of me, on Thursday of this week, so that's the 7th, before class. And that will be 7:30. So we will do flashcards for Unit 2, very similar to what we did for Unit 1. I will record it. So if you're not able to attend early, then you'll be able to view that afterwards. And then the other poll that we discussed was working during break next week. So if you look at the agenda, the syllabus, next week is week 9 of the course. And we agreed to work on the 11th. Now, as I said last week, it is not required as it relates to anything for attendance purposes and the money back guarantee. So we'll still be in Unit 3. I can't 100% guarantee where we'll be at that point, but you just want to make sure that you are watching if you decide not to attend. So let's see. Did I not say the 11th? I thought I did. So just to go back, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So 7:30 this Thursday, which is Unit 2 flashcards, and then class on Monday the 11th at 8 o'clock. And that will be just an additional class to get us a little caught up on where we are. Because like today, I think we're supposed to be pretty far into Unit 3. And then for just kind of on that same train of thought, if you look at the end of the course, we have a standby week, which is week 19. So we will be using that week and probably doing review that week. So for those of you who are maybe planning your test dates pretty close to when we end class, just, keep a thought in your mind that we will be in session that week. So that's going to be the, 20th and 23rd of January. And then we will also probably be having a session, an extra session that I typically do for review, that it's not something that's on the syllabus or anything. It's just an additional review session if there's sufficient interest. And that will be like that following week. I'll figure out how to work that into the schedule. So thank you for all of the thoughts. I appreciate that. And then I got a note here. Will you pick up where we leave off on Thursday during the next required class? So yeah, it's just a class to try to make up some of the time. I don't get, crazy worried about the schedule when we're not on point of where it says on the agenda, just because there are some things that we need to spend more time on. A lot of you in this particular group are earlier in career, so working on your PHR, there are some things that you might not be as familiar with, as comfortable with, And so, my job is to prepare you as best you can, given where you might be sitting in your experience. So we will work on wherever we end on Thursday the 7th, we'll do on the 11th, and then continue on the following Monday on the 18th. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions about the schedule? Anything else? And just a little further out, I know I mentioned this as well, but Jen sent out a message that the time changed on the Unit 2 boot camp session that's scheduled for the 21st of November, and it's originally on the calendar at 1 o'clock, and she moved it to 2:30. So just make those adjustments on your end. All right, anybody else have any questions before we venture along? I have tea today. Normally I have root beer. All right, so let's take a look at Unit 3. So welcome to Unit 3. I think, what we deal with in Unit 3 is people are really overwhelmed in Unit 1. And Unit 1 is a lot of information that nobody necessarily, unless you're sitting for a senior exam, has probably had a lot of experience with. So you feel kind of overwhelmed. You feel like, oh my gosh, I don't know any of this stuff. What am I going to do? Did I make a mistake signing up for this? So a lot of anticipation, a lot of apprehension, some anxiety. And then people get into Unit 2 and they're like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I know Title VII and I'm familiar with recruiting and I know what job descriptions are and I know, something about interviewing, and so you're kind of used to that confidence going up. And then for a lot of people, it goes a little down when we start with Unit 3, because Unit 3 is training and development. So it's not only training in the sense of the typical word of, going to a session and training on whatever particular content, but it's development. So we're going to talk about, for example, performance management related to how do you conduct performance evaluations and what's the different types of evaluations. That will absolutely be on your exam. Then we get into organizational development. And for some people, they have not had any exposure to that. Fortunately, when we look at the exam breakdown, which is what our first slide is here, you can take a look and see that the percentages aren't that high. So if you aren't a subject matter expert in training, or if it's really foreign to you, I'm obviously not going to say that you need to just blow off the entire unit, because that's not at all true. But I don't want you to crazy like, oh my gosh, again. Because units 1, 2, and 5 are so significant in what we do that it's okay if, maybe it's a little more overwhelming for you. I absolutely still recommend, if you haven't already, to take one of the Unit 3 assessments as a baseline. And again, it's okay if you get a 20%. It's just giving you kind of a head start, looking at the whole unit in its entirety. What is it about? What does it consist of? What do I know about this? And I'm sure most of you probably, when you got your books, you might have looked through them to see, hey, what is each unit about? Or if you didn't do that, maybe when you started the unit itself, you looked at the table of contents and all of the areas that would be covered. So the percentages of 10 and 12 apply for the HRCI exams. And then the SHRM exams are a little different story. So the SHRM exams, remember, our percentages are always going to be the same. 50% of a SHRM exam is Unit 1, so big chunk. So even if you are at the CP level, you really have to spend a good amount of time in Unit 1, even if the information is less comfortable for you. When we see the percentages as the same, if you look down here in the box at the bottom, when we look at that area, you'll see the red boxes, which indicate learning and development, and the circles are kind of a little over total rewards, which is not in this unit, it's in the next unit. Workforce management, technology management, You know, there'll be some questions on those items, but as you remember, we looked at those topics already in Unit 2. So kind of a little crossover, viewing things a little differently from the SHRM perspective than the HRCI perspective. And then also the difference between the questions are related to the level, so CP versus SCP. Percentages are the same, but the difficulty of the material would be where you're going to see the differences. And so that becomes really apparent right away when we start looking at the unit opening content, especially the first couple of sections. So any questions about any of that as far as what the content is, what to look for, and obviously we're going to work on it as we go as well. So let me just show you as an example. Let's move on to our next slide, which is our title, T&D in the organization, and then of course our objectives, which the first one right away. Anytime you see the word strategic and you're a senior level test taker, your ears need to be like, woo, I got to pay attention to this. And that's not to say that professional level test takers shouldn't, but the word strategic is definitely going to be something that you should pay particular attention to if you're taking a senior level exam. So identify the strategic alignment between business objectives and training and development, including ROI, which stands for return on investment, and cost benefit analysis. So that whole objective right there really speaks to professional level, senior level candidates, because even if you are in training, but you're not at the senior level, you're probably not going to be looking at the things that we're going to look at to open up the section. Number 2, the ADDIE model. We're going to talk a lot about the ADDIE model. The ADDIE model is used in creating training, assessing training needs, and developing and implementing training programs. It's also a particular model that will serve you very well in many other parts of the exam. And then finally, assess training needs on 3 levels: organizational, task, and individual. So that is what we are going to start out with here this evening. I'm going to say so long for the moment, and let's go ahead and get started on this information. Okay, so the book starts out, of course, good old page 1, introducing the subject of training and development. And so before we cover training and education, let's get an assessment of your knowledge and content. Of this, I want to specifically ask you about training, conducting training. We probably don't have a lot of designers of training in our group, but if we do, then awesome. So where would you assess your knowledge and your level of skill? And probably more knowledge is what I'm looking for in this particular area with, you know, again, my same scale that I use, 1 being brand new, don't know it, 10 being I do training and it's part of my job description, I design training, I'm an adult learning expert, kind of in that zone. All right, so we've got some fairly higher numbers, actually, I'll be honest, than I anticipated seeing. So those of you, I would say, who are maybe 6 and high, well, it doesn't really matter, I'm not going to limit it. So those of you who are saying that they have some training experience, give me a sense of what types of training that you've done. Most of you, or a lot of you, are probably going to say new hire orientation. That's a pretty common one that, you know, most generalists will be involved in, even managers, depending on the organizational structure. So what types of training are you conducting? So Lori, so systems, so what does that mean in more specifics, Lori? Systems related to HR, systems related to HRIS particularly maybe? Angela mentioned district managers on HR processes. Okay, so coaching, counseling, those types of things, or like how to enter in a transaction, for example. Okay, let's see. We've got some things. Let me go back up here. We've got some great answers here, everyone. So Angela's got HR processes, like I said. Evelyn has orientation, safety, sexual harassment. Yeah, sexual harassment is definitely a big one that we frequently see coming from the HR function. Orientation and customer service. Lori mentioned ADP. Okay, so activities revolving around the HR systems. I just wanted to clarify what systems meant. Maureen with harassment prevention. Brooke with leadership development, new hire orientation, performance management, compensation. Wow, Brooke, you're like the gamut of things. That's like full circle right there. Jessica, orientation. Angela said both. All right, Christy was a trainer for, okay, you got to give me a clue on that one, Christy. I don't know what that means. Locum tenens company? That sounds like some sort of butterfly. I'm sure it's not, but let's see what else here. Brandy, NHO, and safety. And, oh, I keep trying to scroll down, you guys. I'm sorry. I'm like, why isn't this working? Training managers, HR processes, systems, coaching, yeah, supervisory training without a doubt. All right, you guys got a lot of stuff going on here. Okay. Oh, and then Christy commented on temp healthcare workers and physicians and all kinds of things. Yeah, I learned that just a chain of thought here. A lot of people might know the expression hospitalist, which is a doctor that, you know, goes around and takes care of patients while they're in the hospital. Well, I have a really big healthcare background, but there's now a term called, I'm going to mispronounce it, interventionist, I think, which is basically a doctor that specializes in critical care. So while patients are in the ICU, they don't see their regular doctor, they see this position. So no, it wasn't that. It wasn't interventionist. It was, I don't know, I'll think about it after the fact, but yeah, it was pretty different. That a lot of times, at least in our hospital, the doctors that you would see, like her primary care physician, for example, doesn't come in, doesn't do rounds. It's all handled by physicians that are working for the hospital. So, changes in healthcare, of course, every day. So when we talk about training and development, the first thing, and thank you for everyone that definitely participated. I'm actually glad to see that you have some experience, and some of this then will feel more comfortable for those of you who've had such experiences. So training in and of itself, and one of the ways that I think about keeping this separated from education is when we go to, for example, sexual harassment training, it's right along the lines of this definition, acquisition of specific skills or knowledge. So sexual harassment training and prevention, defining sexual harassment, what it is, what it isn't, what it looks like, how to report it, all of those things are very specific to that subject. Whereas education, and think here, high school education, a GED is general equivalency diploma. So that is more general knowledge that then we think about what are the classes that we learned in high school. English, math, science, and social studies for the most part, and maybe a language. And then of course our electives. And so same thing with college, you know, those first couple of years are generally prereqs for maybe what you want to go into, but it's still, you know, general knowledge. We got to take those maths again, those Englishes again. So that's the primary difference between training and education. Then the next area that we look at is explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is the type that we can look at that is, as the slide indicates, formalized, communicated, codified. So manuals, formulas, and task specifications. Great example of this would be in your HR system, your intranet, right? And you go into self-service of that module of your ADP system, for example, and there are instructions on how to change your direct deposit or how to upload a change in family status document for benefits. And so it's in a manual that is on the desk, or maybe you're doing training for a new timekeeping system that's rolling out, and you're meeting with the managers and you're presenting them with documents of your training guide that show them first do this, then do this, then do that, with, you know, snapshots from what it looks like in the timekeeping portal. So all of those things develop what we call explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge, on the other hand, is based on individual experiences and is sometimes more difficult to explain. So I'm sure you all have noticed by now that I use a lot of my personal experiences to talk about whatever the concept is that we're working on. And so in doing that, it gives you a different lens to look at the item from. Now, of course, what we want you to be doing is looking at it through the lens of your own experience. But in the case that you might not have that because you've never worked in that particular area or experienced that, you know, I try to immerse my own experience as examples of what that item is. And so then people that have done it will be able to click, remember, and agree, and kind of cement that knowledge because they've maybe done the same. Or someone that hasn't can say, oh, okay, I understand that. And I can make the connection to that based on, you know, my organization or, you know, a conversation or whatever the case may be. So let's see, I saw a couple of questions here. Jessica mentioning, would a handbook be referred to as explicit knowledge? Yes, I mean, technically, most definitely, because it is explaining specifics about the policies of the organizations. When we look at a handbook, it's really not necessarily, sometimes it is, the processes like step A, step B, step C. It's more like this is what PTO looks like as a policy, not necessarily the process of how you go about using your PTO. It might reference the, you know, self-serve portal, for example, but it's not going to necessarily go through the process of how do you request that, but it's going to talk about the policy. So you are getting that explicit knowledge of what is the company's position on paid time off, how much do I get, etc. So yeah, for the most part, I would say yes. All right, moving on, we look at the need for training. I want to go back for a minute and just reflect back on Unit 2. So when we looked at Unit 2, especially under the part about HR planning, what did I say a few different times? It's the right person in the right position at the right time. And so along that same lines, as it relates to HR planning, comes part of that package of our need for training. So getting somebody in the right position at the right time may involve training. If you're introducing a new line of item that you're manufacturing, it's brand new, nobody knows how to do it, you've identified the employees who are going to be working on that machine in that, you know, section, but they have to be trained. And so you've identified and connected that this is our need for training to be able to have these group of individuals come in and be able to perform the tasks that are needed in that job. Now, in some cases, it might be internal training that is done by the maybe supervisors and people that are going to be running that department. In other cases, maybe it's a brand new machine to the organization, and you may contract, a lot of times that will happen, you'll contract with the vendor, the manufacturer, to get them to come in and do training. Another kind of HR related example of that is when I did a major expansion of our timekeeping system. And we went from literal time cards, punch time cards, to the Kronos system. And so our Kronos reps came in, and in tandem, we presented the new system to our managers. So they were there to help out with questions and specifics and be, you know, a support system, because it was completely different from what they had experienced before. So there is some discussion on page 2 and 3 about the skills gap, about illiteracy, and so just looking at, again, what does that potentially provide for in not only your organizations, but, you know, illiteracy is a difficult problem that we have worldwide, but of course in the US, that can potentially affect being able to get employees that we can train to do specific jobs. So our first knowledge check question says, the major difference between training and education is that A, education refers more to acquiring specific skills. B, education is more closely related to learning a particular job. C, training provides more general knowledge. D, training narrows the range of responses, while education broadens the range. Woohoo! Oh my gosh, everybody is getting this question right. Yay! D is the correct answer, right? So when you look at this question and you look at your answer choices, hopefully what you did was ask yourself, is A, you know, a correct statement? And A is not. So education is broad skills, like we just mentioned. Is B correct? Is C correct? C, you know, is not correct. It's specific knowledge. And then when you look at A, B, and C, not all being correct, even if you weren't 100% sure about D, you can get there just by eliminating your answer choices along the way. And that is definitely a test-taking strategy that can be extremely effective when you're not 100% sure of which the correct answer is, but as you read the answer choices, you're like, it's definitely not that, because there's no penalty for guessing, and you absolutely do not want to leave questions unanswered. That's like leaving money on the table to not collect, because a 25% chance of answering the question correctly is better than a 0% chance, which is just essentially going to cost you a potential opportunity. All right, moving on to the next section, which is the strategic alignment of training and development. The section is pretty clear from the transference of the slides to the content on page 4. And one of the things I typically talk a little bit about here is the alignment of how training interacts with different parts of the organization, the HR organization. And so as we look to the next slide, the next 2 slides, we're asking those questions. And remember, going back to what I just said about HR planning, having the right person in the right job at the right time. Then when we're looking specifically at training issues, it's really the who, what, where, when, how, what. I'm sure I didn't say that in the same order, but we've got to identify what training is needed, who's going to do it, how, what's going to be the medium of the training, on-site, off-site, classroom, online, answering all of those questions that have to be addressed to make sure that we are covering all of our bases of what our goals are. And then this slide identifies the connection between the T&D concept and the T&D function with the other parts of HR. And let's just look at one example here. So from an employee relations perspective, if our employees know what they're doing, if they're skilled and trained in their job, then going through a coaching situation and a discussion with your manager about not hitting those performance objectives or the tasks that are required in your job should be an easier discussion if someone is not performing. So having an employee who doesn't have an understanding of where their skill set is and what that looks like can potentially create more issues as it relates to employee relations. So the rest of the items are, obviously they're all described pretty well as far as, performance evaluation, compensation, and also staffing. So it definitely has a part of all of the rest of the organization. And one of the things that's not listed here that I think you just need to maybe put underneath as another area is safety. Because having employees who understand the safety elements of their particular job then also can affect all of those areas. Honestly, it can affect staffing, it can affect performance, it can affect employee relations, even a little bit in compensation depending on what the issue is. So definitely I would add safety to that list. The next page on 6 is a discussion, 6 and 7 really, about funding the training function and what are the ways that that can be done. So in Unit 1, I know it seems like it was way long ago, but we spent some time at the end of the very first section of Unit 1 talking about budgets. So the top-down approach, the bottom-up approach, zero-based budgeting. So if that's not an area that you're familiar with, make sure that you are comfortable with those, especially senior level test takers, I would say. So the ways that the function and the topic of training is covered is different potentially in organizations. So the first way that we look at that is a fixed amount in the training department. So this would mean that the departments throughout the organization identify what types of trainings that they're going to need based on their business plans and provide that information to HR. And those are, even if they're given a ballpark estimate, added into the HR budget under the training section. So that's the first way. The second way is that they come from the operating budget, which means that the cost of that training for the new equipment that I just mentioned is going to be allocated to the department of where the machine is going to sit. So in this case, manufacturing. Then the third option is that the operating departments go to HR and say, we need this training done. And HR, the training department, responds and says, okay, it's basically very similar to those of you who might know the request for proposal process, where you have a scope of work of what needs to be done, and you go out and you find vendors that can perform that work for you. So the RFP process is very common in benefits administration. It's also common when you're going out and you're looking for IT solutions, such as a applicant tracking system or an HRIS system. So that RFP process is done by those operational departments into the training function. And in some companies that are really big, you may have a training and development department that's completely separate. Usually may include organizational development as part of the department, separate from HR. It may still fall under the same umbrella, but someone who's an HR business partner, as an example, would not be performing or be involved in training functions. They may help their particular business unit identify what training might be needed, but they're not going to be the ones doing that training or designing that training. And then our next area is the cost benefit analysis of the training program. and what is going to be the end result of what we're going to get out of this training. So if we're doing a training on safety, as an example, I think that's something that most people can identify with. So we have training on safety related to using a particular piece of equipment. What are the guards on the machine? What is the type of personal protective equipment, PPE equipment, a face guard, safety glasses? You know, what are all of those things that are required? And so if an employee is going to be working in a function that requires those, part of their orientation is going to be safety training. And there's a natural occurrence then, or assumption, if you will, that assuming the individual wears and uses the safety protocol as outlined and as they're trained in, then that's going to improve safety, and it's going to reduce the amount of claims that are then had. And then, of course, there's the issue with an employee who doesn't follow that protocol and then potentially has a safety incident. So all of those different types of cost-benefit analysis. The other thing that you want to pay attention to on page 7 is the categories of what are direct and indirect costs of training. So anything that's direct has to do with the training itself. So on page 7, you've got the categories of the development costs, the materials, the hardware, software, the training time, and production losses. So when we usually look at, this is done a couple of different ways in practice. So a lot of us that are doing benefit analysis or the ROI of the training, everything that has to do with creating the training, including the cost of the materials, the cost of the trainer. You know, perhaps you bring somebody in from the outside that specializes from the vendor of that equipment, but it's not included, so you have to pay them additional money, and you decide that it's worth it to make sure that they're getting instruction directly from the manufacturer of the machine, for example. So all of those pieces and costs are going to be included in direct costs, even the cost of meals as an example. So a lot of us will go to a half-day training and they might have breakfast when we get there. So those would be direct costs. Indirect costs are generally going to be related to production losses. So during the time that the individual is in training, they're not at their job making their widgets. And so the obviously operations department, production department is gonna have to figure out, how is that work going to be made up? Is it gonna be overtime? Is it gonna be having another employee fill that slot? You know, what are those? And so those are actually costs that we can allocate expenses to when we're looking at our cost ratio or return on investment cost. At the bottom of Unit 7, there is a formula for cost per trainee. That's a very simple formula. I don't necessarily think that test takers at a professional level would have to memorize that, but if you did, it's very simple. At the senior level, what a question like this would look like would give you a list of the expenses associated with the training by category, and then ask you to determine what is the ROI of that training, or what is the cost per trainee. And so you have to pay particular attention if the question differentiates between direct and indirect costs. Like, let's say they list all the costs, including the indirect costs, but the question asks for the cost per trainee of direct costs. So that's a good example where you've got to really be reading your question well to pay particular attention to what is actually being asked. So this is cost per trainee, which is also at the bottom of page 7. And then our knowledge check question says, Which of the following would be considered an indirect cost when analyzing the cost benefit of a training program? A, lost production time. B, the cost of the facility. C, the training materials. D, the included meals. And let's see, okay, while y'all are answering, a message came in and I didn't see it at the time. I'm sorry, it said, I just missed that. What should SPHR folks remember? To be honest with you, I don't know what particular point I was on. I could have been talking, I probably was talking about the strategic alignment of HR. Also, I think the cost benefit analysis questions are particular to senior level test takers. So you might need to go back and listen to the recording on that one. Sorry, I didn't catch the question right as it was asked. All right, good deal. Yes, A is the correct answer. Then the next area that we look at, it really goes right along with what I've been talking about, which is the return on investment analysis. This is definitely something that would be at a senior level. I've had to write many reports over time outlining a proposal for training. What do I anticipate all of the direct and indirect costs to be? What do I believe is going to be the return on investment, which is basically what's the value of this training. And certainly there are different types of training that are going to be required based on your organization. So when I worked for the medical device company, we were regulated by two different bodies. One was the FDA through the federal government, and then the other was we were ISO certified. And so ISO certification, some of you might be familiar with that in manufacturing, has its own specific types of training that you're required to demonstrate that you've trained individuals in. And so when we look at return on investment, we're going to try to measure that information in terms of reporting so that we can demonstrate that the training that we did and the money that we spent created value for the organization. And then on page 9, there's some information, no slide on this, but managing training in difficult times. And it's an unfortunate fact of business life that some of you might have also experienced, that when the budget starts getting squeezed, training is what gets cut. And a lot of times I've worked with executives who say, no, we're going to find that money somewhere else. Maybe it's supplies, maybe it's overtime, because they understand that we have to be able to keep our employees' skills current to be able to do what we need to do to be successful in the company and to be better than our competition. And so squeezing training and cutting it out, although it is going to reduce your expenses, is not always the right solution. But unfortunately, I've worked in many a place who, boop, cancel that training, cancel that training, cancel that training. And it, is very unfortunate, but that's a lot of times what happens. All right, now we move into different types of models of training. Our first model is the systems model. And this is essentially 3 phases. And the 3 phases you'll see here on our slide are the assessment phase, the training and development phase, and the evaluation phase. So in each of these different phases, what I would say is you need to be comfortable with what happens in each stage. But when we look at it, I'm not going to look at, talk through every single one of these because I think it's pretty self-sufficient. But if we look at, one of the things I want to point out to you is this word assess. From a test perspective, if you can remember the process of, and I'm just going to go right into it because it's essentially relatively the same when we talk about the ADDIE model. So the ADDIE model is an acronym that stands for Assessment, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. What I suggest that people do, especially if you have no history with the ADDIE model, it's brand new, you've never seen it before, it's not something that instantly rolls off your tongue. When you go into the training room, or excuse me, the testing room, you're going to get a piece of paper or papers, blank, and a pencil, or you're going to get a whiteboard. And so I suggest you're going to have a few minutes to kind of get yourself acclimated. There's going to be a short tutorial on the computer about making sure that you understand how to use the computer and the function of the exam. And I always did this myself, is I just took, a memory dump of particular areas that I really was struggling in. So for me, as an example, it was reliability and validity. And so the first thing I did was just scratch that on my paper so that when I got to a question, I didn't have to try so hard to remember what that meant. ADDIE is something that I think everybody should write down and be able to recognize what this process looks like. One of the reasons I feel strongly about this is because ADDIE can be applied to almost everything in HR as it relates to recognizing that a policy needs to change, taking action on something that happens as a result of an accident. I mean, there are hundreds of examples I could give you where the ADDIE model, taken out of the context of training per se, is something that we would do. When we talked about, in Unit 1, we talked about HR research, right? So if we've identified that there's a problem, or we're trying to determine if there's a problem, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to gather data. If we believe that our turnover is higher than our competitors and we want to evaluate that, what are we going to do? We're going to assess data, and we're going to analyze that data. And then if in fact that is true, that our turnover is higher, then we're going to go through the rest of the steps. We're going to design, how are we going to do that? What does that look like? Develop the program, activities, implement them, and then evaluate them by comparing the program itself and the results of the program to the objectives of what we are trying to accomplish. And maybe our objective is a 10% reduction in turnover in our operating departments over a quarter, whatever those are, those specific objectives that we're putting together. So most definitely, the ADDIE model is your friend. I had a really sweet student one time, it was earlier this year, it was at the beginning of the year, who just didn't have but a couple of years of HR experience, and her name was Addie. And she was so cute. She's like, oh my gosh, there's something, in HR named after me, and I had no idea. And I said, well, I guarantee you will never forget it now, because obviously you've made that association. All right, any questions about the ADDIE model or the systems model? I think those are two really important takeaways of this particular section. Okay, well, let's finish up this section by looking at training needs analysis. We look at a needs analysis on 3 different levels. And so this is a particular area that everyone should know, definitely professional level test takers as well. So our organizational analysis is looking at exactly what it says here. How is the organization meeting its goals? And you can look on page 12 under item number 1 at the bottom, and there's all kinds of measurements listed here. Accidents, turnover, absenteeism, efficiency, quality, maintenance. So they're definitely not things that are just HR. We're looking at that from a systemic whole organization lens, I guess, if you would. Then the next level is the task analysis. So what are the skills that the workforce needs? to accomplish the goals. So going back to my example about the new piece of equipment that is coming on, what are the skills that are needed to accomplish the goal of that new product line, selling what our projected sales are in terms of volume of units in that new line. And then the last level is individual analysis. So this would be something that we would see, let's say a performance review has been done on for you, and looking at pros and cons, strengths, and I don't like the word weaknesses. I use the word opportunities because weakness has a negative denotation and an opportunity has a positive one. So your boss may say to you, you know, I recognize, or I've, you know, assessed that you really struggle in this particular area, and here's some things that I want to talk about potentially that could be training opportunities for you to improve in that skill. Or it may even be that you are looking to get promoted, but you don't have the particular skills that meet the job description that's needed. Maybe you have a beginner's level of Excel, but to get into this HRIS position, you've got to have an intermediate or maybe an advanced, because it's a, you know, higher level analysis. So that's the individual level, looking at all of those. And then the really the last thing that we look at in this section is the methods, rather, for assessing training needs. And this goes back to HR research that we looked at. It also goes back a little bit to selection and the different types of items that we talked about in the selection process. So you're going to see and should be, you know, recognizing some familiarity with some of these items. So when we talked about, just to make a couple of connections here, in Unit 2, we talked about the job description process and what were the items that we used to create job descriptions. And so one of them might be surveys and questionnaires to the employees completing those jobs about what their activities were in those jobs, in those tasks. And so the same applies relative to training. You could use surveys, you could use interviewing, you could use performance data. So maybe all of your employees that work in administrative assistant roles have a basic level of Word that, you know, for whatever reason, that's where they are, but they need to have an intermediate level. So you might contract with someone that does Microsoft training to have them come in and do all of your admin assistance. So that would be an assessment of training that you would analyze from the appraisals or identification of that need, maybe by someone who, you know, you've consistently heard, let's say from 5 different departments, that their admin assistant doesn't do as well in Word as you would like them to be able to do. So you might get the feedback that way. And then all the rest of them are also described in the book. And then we end this section with a knowledge check question that says, in assessing training needs, an examination of production efficiency, labor costs, turnover, and accidents would be part of which training needs analysis? A, personnel, B, task, C, operations, D, organizational. Okay, got some responses flowing in here. Gonna give it just another minute or so. Not minute, but a few moments. All right, so I would say here, and this is what I expected. So that a good majority of you selected D, which is the correct answer, organizational. Lots of people selected C. I would say that's the second best answer. And here's what you're identifying. When you're looking at the list of things that are in the question, production efficiency, labor, turnover and accidents, you're associating them with operational functions. And the vendor put this answer in here of operations directly because they are expecting that people that don't know what the 3 levels of assessment are going to pick operations, because they're going to just automatically say, oh yeah, okay, production, that's operations, labor costs, operations, when the actual answer is organizational. Because at the organizational level, we look at all of those factors and more. And so I just want to refer you back to, in the book, page 12, item number 1, those are all organizational types of indices that you would look at. Some other people said A. I think people that are selecting A probably picked out turnover and accidents and think, well, that has to do with people. Maybe, you know, seeing labor, the word labor is a distracting term. So let's see a couple messages here. So the question says it wouldn't be operations at all. Now, it may be in the operations function, but the level of assessment that comes from is the organizational level. So the thing that I think might help you to differentiate between the 3 really is organizational is all of those indices that have to do with turnover and safety and operations. So operations is a part of organizational indices. Then our second one is tasks. So the task level is associated with a particular job and what are the skills that are needed for that job. And then the individual level is related to that particular individual's skills, so, or group of individuals. So if we know that the individual is struggling as it relates to a particular skill that they need on their job, then we would address that at an individual basis. So if, back to my Microsoft example, if performance reviews are analyzed and only one of the admin assistants had a need for more Microsoft Word training, we're not going to go and train the whole department. We're going to train just that one individual, or the whole, when I say department, I mean people in that function across the organization. So that would be looking at it as an individual analysis. If all of the admin assistants were going to get new job duties that would require them to be able to perform at an expert Microsoft Word level, then that would be at the task level, because we're looking at the job itself, not the person doing the job. So, and then at the organizational level, those are looking at all of the different types of analysis that affect the organization versus one particular position or one particular individual. Let's see, Lori mentioning this is one where we could have ruled out operations because the 3 types of analysis are organizational, task, and individual. I did not use this logic, but which should have appeared to me. And here's the challenge with that. The test organizers know exactly what you are likely to do if you don't remember that those are the 3, those are the 3 levels. So if you see assessing training needs and your brain doesn't connect into, there are 3 levels and they are organizational, task, and individual, you are more likely to then choose A or C based on what the question is asking, the examples of what's asked in the question. So that's a situation where it would be hard to rule out, you know, the other choices if you don't know. And that's the point of the question, is can you recognize what those fit into as a category of training needs assessment? So, all right, good dialogue on that. That definitely is something that appears on the exam. Anybody have any questions before we venture on to our next section, which is principles of training and development? Okay. This next section has some objectives, as do they all. The first one is to explain and apply the 3 learning theories. Next is to comprehend the 4 learning curves and the situations in which they likely occur. And third, understand and apply the diverse levels, styles, and strategies of learning. Okay, I'm going to be 100% honest with you guys. This particular section is so heavy. There is so much information in it. Like if we think about, go back to the, recruiting section as an example. The recruiting section's pretty easy to take on. This particular section, do not beat yourself up if you are like, oh my goodness, there is a lot, because there is. This section is really something that you would see in, and if anybody has their, bachelor's in HR or their master's, this is a very specific class that we take, and all of the principles of what do we look at when we're designing training and what do we need to be aware of from a theoretical and principled approach are the things that we look at. So please don't beat yourself up too bad if you're just like feeling very overwhelmed by this section. When we start out with learning theories, and I'm going to kind of carve out as we go what I think is more important, less important kind of thing. So we start out with learning theories. And so these are ways that when a trainer is designing training, they have to be taken into consideration of what is the training that we are trying to create. What is it for? What is the way that it's best going to be learned? What's the method that we're going to teach it when we get to the development part? So this is kind of the D of design and some of the D of development when we look at the ADDIE model. So we have to start out looking at the way that the theories of, how do we learn information? And not just from an HR perspective, but how does a person learn information on the job? Even how do they learn information in general? And there's some discussion between, adult learning and non-adult learning a little later in this section. So the 3 particular learning theories that we're looking at are classical, operant, and social cognitive theory. The first one of classical learning, I'm going to bet that there were some of you that were like, hey, yeah, I remember this. Anybody feel like that? That's right. Exactly, Jessica. Pavlov's dogs, 100%. So if you're not familiar with this, Pavlov was a researcher that was able to prove that when a dog had a bell rang of stimulus for food, their response was their mouth would salivate to indicate that they were being stimulated by this bell, and versus where the bell wasn't rung. So the connection was made that the bell was the conditioning that was needed to create that response of salivation. So that's something that's been around for forever. Pretty simple to a lot of us. Yeah, a lot of us are saying they remember this. The next one is operant conditioning. we kind of go from easy to medium to hard, in my opinion. So operant conditioning is observable behavior and reinforcements of that behavior. Operant conditioning, they mention B.F. Skinner, who's kind of the father of operant conditioning. And essentially that observable behavior equals reward. There's a lot of dialogue in here, especially on page 19, about, for example, you see the S's and the R's in the chain. I would say of these three types of, learning theories that everybody should know, obviously, what they are. Senior level test takers really need to have some advanced knowledge in these particular areas, because you might get a situational judgment question about a particular type of training program that you need to design, and based on the way that the program is described or what the needs analysis shows, what type of conditioning would you use? And then you're going to be given choices. So you're really going to have to kind of dig a little lower in this particular area. So operant conditioning continues on page 20 and talks about the next section, which is reinforcement contingencies. And these are listed here. They're also outlined 1 through 5 on page 20. And one of the ways that I remember these for my own learning is thinking about what happens when you do something right. And I take it back to child rearing because it just helps me remember it the most. When let's take it way back. So when you're potty training your child and your child has a successful potty, you respond by positively reinforcing them, right? Yay, good, you did, whatever. And so you're letting them know that they did great, they're a big boy or big girl. That's positive reinforcement. And so as you go through and look at each of these, then you're going to, what I would suggest is use that kind of thought process that I just described and make your own notes as to how you connect those. So punishment, for example, if somebody does something wrong, they get an unpleasant consequence. So, for example, you arrive late a certain number of times, or you collect points on your attendance policy, and the consequence is a write-up. That's a punishment contingency, even though, of course, we use employee counseling as hopefully a way to encourage employees to do better and correct the issue. It's still punitive in nature, right? They're still getting written up for that action. So the consequence of that tardiness is counseling. So that's a punishment. And then going through the rest of them: avoidance, escape, extinction. Think about the other thing I like to think about too is a hot stove. When children are young, if we're always like, don't touch the stove, don't touch that. And so if they do, they're going to learn that that burner equals that hurts because I got burned. So it's unpleasant. Let's see, Brooke, be aware of operant conditioning. I would say everybody needs to be aware and understand what all three theories are about, the basics of the theories. But if you're a senior level test taker, most definitely be much more deeper into it. And then our next slide talks about reward schedules. So this is also a part of this Skinner's theory, which says the timing of the reinforcement is important related to what you're trying to reinforce. So we've got the bottom of page 20, continuous, intermittent, and interval. And under intermittent, number 2, and interval, number 3, you add another layer of having to learn and remember this, which is fixed and variable. So a fixed ratio on intermittent would be on every 10th instance, you got whatever particular reinforcement happens with that. Where interval, think about, I like to think about interval with interval training. So if you're ever on a treadmill and you do your set for interval, it means that you're going to go 3 minutes and then 5 minutes and then 3 minutes, you know, whatever that interval is of, you know, hill climbing or, you know, whatever the case could be. It can also be fixed or variable. So let's look at, with all of that said and done, the knowledge check question for this section says, for most people, supervisor compliments are according to what type of reward schedule? A, continuous, B, fixed ratio, C, variable ratio, or D, fixed interval? While you all are answering that question, I know we've got a minute or so left to the top of our time. So I am going to finish social cognitive theory on this lesson just because it connects together with what the theories are. So I would say definitely if you're a senior level test taker, hang in there for a few minutes if you can, or regardless if you can't, then, you know, definitely try to pick up the rest of the section through recording. So when we meet again on Thursday, remember we're at 7:30 for those of you participating in cards for Unit 2, and then we'll finish the remainder of the section. We're also going to do Unit 3 or Section 3.3, and we're also going to do 3.4. So let me get those page numbers. Just one moment. We might actually jump into 3.5. We'll see how it goes. But definitely through page 32, or I'm sorry, 62. So the remainder of the section, and then 39 through 62. Okay, so this is always a tough question. And the answer is actually, I would say some of, maybe 50-50, if you will. The answer is, I like totally lost my place and I don't want to say what I think it is and have it not be that. So just give me 1 second. Yeah, okay, I was right. It's been a long couple of days, so I just wanted to double check myself. So C, variable ratio. So let's look a little closer at this question before we move on, because a lot of people did not get this right. So what are we being asked about? That's the first thing that you're going to look at. So we're being asked about supervisor compliments. So even if you didn't have a lot of recognition about intervals and reward schedules, and so you see reward schedule in the question and you're like, that I don't remember. We can use some rationale to kind of look at this question. So the topic is supervisor compliments. So when we think about getting a compliment from our supervisor, we can pretty much knock out continuous, because does our supervisor give us compliments after every single thing we do all the time? Probably not. They don't. You turn in a report that you turn in, you know, every 2 days, you know, and they give you a compliment on the report. That's not likely. If you have that kind of supervisor, awesome, but that's not likely. Then the next ones that we can potentially take away are fixed ratio and fixed interval, because fixed ratio and interval designate that it's for a fixed reason. In this case, we're looking at compliments. So a fixed item would basically say we could look at intermittent or interval, because those are both fixed, but essentially a fixed would be on intermittent. If you look at page 20, number 2, fixed that reward every nth response. So that would be to say every time you do something right in your job, every 10th time you get rewarded by your supervisor, a compliment. So again, that's not probably really likely that your supervisor is paying particular attention to every 9th item that you do, for example. So the fixed piece, we can kind of, logically talk through whether it's fixed ratio or fixed interval. And that really leaves us with a variable ratio. And when we think about compliments, it's pretty likely that we get compliments now and then, right? They're not on a certain schedule. They're not every Monday morning at 9 o'clock. They're not every 10th response to a project that we do. And they're definitely not generally going to be continuous. So does that make sense? Those of you who didn't select C, talking through that make a little more sense to you? In my opinion, it's kind of hard to remember those, looking at what's 1, 2, and 3 on page 20. So, all right, let's finish up for the evening by taking a look at the social cognitive theory. This particular theory is Albert Bandura, who came up with this, related to, it's also referred to as the social learning theory. And this particular theory says that how you act and how you behave has to do with the consequences of that behavior. So if you know that you are going to, let's go back to the write-up for a moment on attendance. So if you know that you're going to get written up for being late, but it's not going to be until the 5th time that happens. Let's say you know the attendance policy, or maybe some of you might have attendance policies that involve points. I had a really interesting discussion when my daughter was in the hospital, a couple different units that she was in, with employees that work there, because I used to work there. And so just chatting about, what's new, what's different, this, that, they were talking about point systems as it related to attendance. And so they have, 2 points for this, that, whatever. You get to 4 points, you get a write-up. You get to 10 points, you get fired. And so I was asking a person in this same position that was bedside, one particular job, and it was crazy how all over the board it was about documentation. So one employee said that and these are all people doing the same job. Her supervisor, if you had documentation, your kid was sick, whatever the case was, then you didn't have points. Where another person said, I gave notes for every single absence I had in those 3 days, and I still got 6 points. So it was like, oh my gosh, from somebody like me who is into employee relations, it was like all over the board. So yeah, the consistency, a couple people mentioning to me. So that's social cognitive theory, that someone's behavior is going to be influenced by consequences, whether those be positive, neutral, or negative consequences. And, for whatever reason, I guess I always go back to kids when I think about this, and my kids know, even despite the fact that they have health issues, that my motto of parenting is choices and consequences. So you better think about what you're going to do before you do it, and what the consequences, they know what they're going to be, even as teenagers. And so that's a huge part of social cognitive theory. So a couple of things that I want to point out about this. The first one is that when you look at this model here on our slide, you'll see that there are 3 elements of this theory. So personal factors, which are going to be, what do you believe? What do you know? What are your ethics? What's your background? So things that are important and personal to you as it relates to the behavior. and its influence, how are those influenced in the environment? So an example of this would be, and I'm taking them off topic tonight and out of HR, but no, I can use an HR one. So let's say that you get in with the bad crowd at work, and you get in, we probably wouldn't be doing that in HR, but you know, the employees do, and they get in with the crowd that doesn't always do the right thing and maybe has some ethical and compliance issues, and you know, people in their group consistently steal lunches, right? So even if you have a personal factor, a personal belief of not doing that because you think it's wrong, sometimes the environment affects and has a determination on your behavior. So that's where this concept of reciprocal determination comes into play. So maybe someone who wasn't involved in something, I'll use my son as an example. So my son kind of started getting in, this happened in 7th grade, getting in with a little bit of the wrong crowd. They were going to like the Dollar Tree, whatever. And my child has never stolen anything in his life until he started hanging out with these kids. And then, you know, a dollar candy bar or whatever it is. And eventually I found out about it. And when my son basically said to this group, you know, we had to talk about, he never got in trouble legally, but we had to talk about, you know, that that's not how he was raised. And he said, I know it was the peer pressure, it was the environment. And when he basically went back and told that group he didn't want to hang out with them anymore, they beat him up, and he ended up in the hospital because he basically pushed back against them and said, I don't want to be with you people anymore, essentially. And they set him up, they got him to come somewhere where they were, and they beat him up. And so that's obviously a very, you know, direct non-work way, but you can insert any particular situation in that. So a couple other important points are vicarious learning, which is at the bottom of page 21, and imitative learning. So these are about imitating others and learning by imitating others. So in the same example I gave with my son, he felt the peer pressure, which altered his behavior because of the environment that he was in. It occluded his personal factors. And so it's a lot of times how, I know there's probably some of you out there who do the whole, you know, talk with your kids of, well, if your friend jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge kind of thing? So that's the primary thing about social cognitive theory. As the section continues, and I'm not going to go through it for the purposes of our discussion, those of you who are senior test takers, definitely page 22, symbolic learning, behavioral modeling. At the bottom, there's when the key term, where the key terms are, I would definitely say that. And then the last thing, just to jump it in, because it really finishes out this first half of this section, is about I always say this wrong, androgyny. Yeah, I think that's right, which is the theory of adult learning. And so when we are creating these trainings, then we have to think about that in considering how we're going to create training for adults. So that's why when a trainer might design and develop the training plan, they create the goals and the objectives in the design, and then in the development of the actual training itself, we may put in active participation. So maybe you have to get together in a small group and work on and discuss a business problem or a project. So we've got the participation, we've got the collaborative, we've got the involvement, versus sitting there and being, you know, just going through listening. So that's one of the reasons that, for example, I try to ask questions, get you guys to think about things, participate. I wish I could do that a lot more, actually. So that is really a good stopping point. So we will pick up on page 27 with the principles of learning. As I said, we'll finish up the remainder of this section and then power through the next 3 after that. All right, I think I've got everything. Let me see. Christy wasn't able to attend Thursday. No, Christy, you may have been a few minutes late to coming to class. I addressed that in the beginning of class that my daughter was hospitalized. She was in critical care for a couple of days, so I'm a little behind. So it hasn't been posted yet. So you haven't missed it, not at all. Let's see, someone else saying you said bottom of 22 terms, and let me go back to that for just 1 second. No, just I guess what I meant was, I'm sorry if I misspoke it, but the terms that are in that section. So for example, symbolic learning. So any of the bolded items, then definitely make sure that you're looking at those. Okay, a couple people mentioning missing Thursday. So I'll have that posted by tomorrow. Really important. Hopefully you heard. Everybody else can jump off if you need to. But hopefully if you did miss class or you were not here at the beginning of class today, I did mention that we went into some pretty important things related to scheduling. So let me just recap those for those of you who might not know that. And then one other question I'll mention real quick before that. The reading, again, I just mentioned that we're going to do sections, the remainder of this section, 3.2, and then through 3.5 for class on Thursday, which is, I think, page 62. All right, so let me jump back to the schedule real quick. So we did some polling in class on Thursday, and here's the things that we came up with. So on Thursday, we're going to do our flashcards for Unit 2. That will be starting at 7:30. And then we will, next week is our technically mid-study break. And so we need to make up some ground, if you will. So we are going to be having class on Monday the 11th at the same regular time at 8 p.m. And we'll just be on whatever section we are based on how far we get this Thursday. It is not mandatory because you're committed based on the syllabus. So if you don't want to come, you want to take that week off, that's fine. Just, of course, make sure that you follow up with the recording for that. And then I also mentioned about the end of the course. I mentioned that today at the beginning of class, that we will be going all the way through, I'm anticipating at this point, our additional standby week, which is indicated on the syllabus, and that is week 19, which would be class dates the 20th and the 23rd. So I think that's important for folks to know as you're making a decision about when your test date is going to be. So that's, make sure that you're planning on that. Let's see, another message here. So no, we will not have class on 11/14. I thought about it, honestly, based on where we're at, and I just feel like people need a break. So you will not be docked for attendance if you don't attend even on the 11th, because it's a voluntary class basically. Yeah, no problem. I'm in the brain dead space too. Okay, another statement here. One other thing I'm struggling with, and maybe if the program is open to feedback, could help others. Yeah, of course. Anything. We always want to, work on making things better and different. And so you're welcome to send it to me via email, or me and Jen, or whatever. Let's see, since I'm on the West Coast, it's hard to make it at 5 p.m. Or the earlier study sessions. I completely understand. One of the things that just might have happened based on when you selected the course is we, not every single time, but most of the time throughout the year, we offer a Sunday, Wednesday class, and that class doesn't start until 9 p.m. Eastern time, because I usually teach that class, which would be 5 or 6 rather. So that, yeah, and it just happens to be when they are available. And then we also are now offering classes during the day, which have really taken off. They're 12 to 1 Eastern time. I teach one of those as well. The challenge with those is they're only an hour, so they're really fast, and I don't like that part of it. But a lot of times people like that because it's during the business day. I think especially those individuals who are supported by their companies, like maybe tuition reimbursement, or their company's paying for it, or, you know, it's part of their performance goals. I see a lot of folks like that. And then that's one of the reasons that I ask about, like, for the knowledge chat or for the flashcards, you know, it's really kind of going by the polls. And in one of my classes, I went back and forth. So that's something that I could do too. Maybe the rest of this session, I wouldn't mind doing it. I had a couple West Coast people where, you know, one set of flashcards we did before, the next set we did after. It's going to be recorded regardless, but to kind of accommodate those sessions. And definitely with Coach's Corner, you know, 8 o'clock is just the, you know, kind of best overall time. I don't think we would get as many people if we did it later. So yeah, you just definitely want to make sure that you stay as current as possible with content. But I get, you know, sometimes you might hop in a few minutes after things start and you're like, oh, what did we already talk about? And then, you know, to go back after the fact and listen is disjointed sometimes. I feel that way a lot of times about when we don't stay 100% on track with the other group, that, you know, I'll be covering something that they've already covered in the other group, and they kind of have to sit through it again with me and still catch up on what they missed. But it's just kind of the way things happen. You know, we all have our, you know, individual styles, and, you know, the expectation is that we flex things as much as we can based on the learners that we have. So in the beginning of our class, when I asked that question about, you know, how many people are doing PHR or CP, it was 85% plus of the group. So that means that things like, you know, what we've talked about so far, Title VII, the ADA, we'll get to FMLA, and we'll, you know, those are subjects that I know are going to be on the test, and it's super important for people that don't have as much experience to be really, really good on those. And that's another reason for Coach's Corners too. Like, I'm doing Coach's Corner tomorrow night, and I'm doing the ADA. So you guys probably wouldn't necessarily want to come to that because we just spent a lot of time in class, but yeah. So I'll take that into consideration, most definitely. Thank you for that feedback, and maybe we'll just, I don't want to change it for this session because it's already on the books, but I don't have a problem at all, you know, going back and forth, because then you get East Coast people who say, you know, by the time we're done, it's 10 o'clock and I've still got work to do from my job. And so I think going back and forth can be a good solution to that. All right. Yeah, you're welcome, of course. Anybody else? We still got a handful of folks here that might just be hanging out. All right, well, we are all set, it looks like, for the evening. So I will see y'all on the flip side. Have a good night, and we'll see you on Thursday. Thanks, everybody. Take care.